Hello, everyone, and welcome to Kumi Now. Thank you for joining us for this latest online gathering as we talk about the Palestinian right of return. We are glad that you are able to join us this week. My name is Sarah. I'm your host, a volunteer with Sabil, joining you from Nebraska in the US.
Yay!
On the land of the Ponca, Omaha, Winnebago, Dakota, and Ottawa peoples, past and present, especially as we talk about imagining the return of the Palestinian people to their homeland. It is so important to face the realities about whose land each of us lives. Before we go further, I'd like to remind you that our webinar is being broadcast live on Facebook and will be posted to YouTube. If you want to make sure your photo does not accidentally appear online, please turn off your camera. We would also greatly appreciate it if you could quickly share one of the links that are being put in the chat so that others may still join us today. As usual, if you have an idea or project you'd like to share for up to 5 minutes in a future meeting, you can email us at kumi@kuminow.com. So we will start with our weekly activism survey, and the poll will be launched. And just note there are 3 questions, so be sure to scroll down so that you can see and respond to all of them. So as usual, we're asking what actions you took in the last week relating to human rights. And then question number 2, one likely reason that Palestinian refugees were not allowed to return to Israel following 1948 is that they had been welcomed and assimilated into neighboring countries. The UN would only provide aid if they remained in their refugee camps. The costs would have been too great for the UN, Israel, and Palestinians to afford. Or the last answer, their return would create a binational state in Israel with a Jewish minority. And the question number 3, over 600 Palestinian communities in Israel have been destroyed primarily due to the first answer, systemic destruction by Israel, or destruction by fleeing Palestinians so that Israelis could not use them, or weather and neglect as they have been left empty, or the last answer, vandals and looters. All right, be sure to get those answers in. We're going to be moving on. So thank you to everyone who was able to take action in the last week. And thank you to everyone in advance for the action that they are going to take this coming week. The answer to question number 2, asking for a likely reason that Palestinian refugees were not allowed to return to Israel following 1948 is the last answer. Their return would create a binational state in Israel with a Jewish minority. And the answer to question number 3, asking about the primary reason that Palestinian communities in Israel have been destroyed is the first answer, systemic destruction by Israel. So we hope that you will find this session interesting and informative today. I'd like to start by having our speakers introduce themselves. Omar, go ahead and introduce yourself from Sabil.
Yes, for the newcomers, I am Omar Harami from Sabil, Jerusalem. I will be giving a very short introduction after Omar, the other Omar, today introduces himself on what has been happening in Palestine and Israel. Usually I focus on things that have not been in the media very much. Thank you. Omar?
Yes, I hear you. Yeah, good evening. I'm Umar al-Ghubari. I'm a Palestinian citizen of Israel. I work with an organization based in Tel Aviv and Jaffa called in Hebrew Zochrot, which means remembering. And we do a work in order to raise the awareness regarding the Palestinian Nakba and the Palestinian refugees and the Palestinian right to return and the practical return among the Israeli Jewish society as part of our mission to promote awareness and justice in Palestine. Do you want me to start, Omar, or you want to?
Yes, we will. No, Omar will first be giving us the news from Palestine. Yeah, thank you, Omar.
Thank you very much. So just as a reminder for the people who do not receive the Sabil Wave of Prayer, it comes out every week. Actually, it came out yesterday. It gives an update on what has been happening, a general update on the ground. What I will be sharing today was not mentioned in the newsletter yesterday. So again, it seems an never-ending chapter of our Palestinian life. Israel continues to apply administrative detention. That means that when they arrest people, they do not have to accuse them or let them know of why they have been arrested for an unlimited period of time. And since the past 10 years, Palestinian prisoners, mainly administrative detainees, have been going through different hunger strikes to bring the attention of the world and exert pressure on Israel to put an end to this unrealistic and inhumane method of administrative detention. In the picture, you see Hisham Abu Hawass. He's been for over 122 days on hunger strike. It seems that every Palestinian prisoner who wants to force Israel to stop this, the administrative detention, they have to go for 3, 4, 5 months of hunger strike until that they reach a point that they are between life and death, that Israel agrees to let them go free. Those people have not been accused or have no right to appear in court in Israeli military courts. So please hold Hisham in your prayers and in your thoughts. The Israeli Knesset passed for the first reading. So it doesn't mean that these laws have been implemented, but they have they made an important progress towards being approved by the Israeli Knesset to be implemented as laws. And the 3 laws that many of our brothers and sisters inside Israel, Palestinians who hold the Israeli citizenship, have already protested and saying these laws are racist by nature. So the 3 laws, one law is that it says that it gives more power to prisoner authority, to Israeli prison authorities to use more force and pressure on Palestinian prisoners. So this is something that contradicts international agreements and human rights. The second law is that in certain kinds of demonstrations that are nationalistic, the Israeli police is entitled to call in the army for support. So in almost every country around the world, when there's a demonstration, the citizens are demonstrating against a specific situation or against a certain policy, it is the police who manages the crowds. There's no need to call the army against the people, the citizens of that country. Israel is saying that it is it seems that it's from the language that is being used, that this is only when the Palestinians inside Israel will demonstrate, the army can interfere and support the police. And usually the army is known to use more force than the police. The third law is saying that the Israeli police would no longer need a warrant to break into or search houses. From the language or from the opposition that has been introduced by the joint list, the Palestinian, a coalition of mainly Palestinian political parties who live inside Israel, are saying that this would target the Palestinian community. In democracies, you need a warrant. Israel is saying that the police does no longer need a warrant. It's not that these warrants would be very difficult for the police to obtain, but regardless, At least this is an extra step in the discrimination against the Palestinian citizens inside Israel. Today also, the Israeli army broke into Birzeit University, one of the oldest and most well-known universities inside the West Bank. One student was shot with a rubber bullet. Another student was arrested, and many parts of the university property have been destroyed by the Israeli army. Palestinians have complained because universities should be a safe place for people to practice, to study, to seek education, and to practice freedom of expression. The army has no place entering universities, at least in democratic systems. Also, just to share some news on the positive side, in the picture you see Antonio Shakur. He's a young Palestinian from Haifa. He just won the prize, the Palestine Prize of Music. So he's one of the most talented young people with music when it comes to Palestine. So it is wonderful that we are recognizing and encouraging the talents within our society. We will be sharing hopefully next week some parts of his music. He's a genius when it comes to music. He's very passionate. Also a beautiful success story. In the picture you see Mu'min Bitar. He is from Gaza. He was born without the ability to see, yet this did not stop him. He has started a very successful radio station show, a radio show at a radio station local in Gaza that has become extremely viral, and he comments about sports in Gaza and internationally. He's being followed by tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people in Gaza and outside. He's a real success story. He himself is an athlete. He's a karate master who has received multiple awards. And it is beautiful that in Palestine, talents continue to grow regardless of all of the challenges, the occupation, and the conflict. Thank you very much. And I think we go to Omar.
Yes, thank you, Omar. And we'll just pause briefly to honor the stories and the suffering that we have heard and the news from the ground. And now we'll turn our attention to our main issue of the week, the Palestinian right of return, where Omar from Zochrot will speak. And if you have a question while he is speaking, please type it in the chat. We'll collect those questions to ask him at the question and answer period in the end. Omar, please go ahead with your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure to be with you all. I just want to ask the host to make me a co-host. I want to share some photos, please. You'll be in charge of time. Just let me know how long time I have to speak. What I will try to do is to talk about the right to return, but I prefer to make a background for to understand how and why this ethnic cleansing and Palestinian refuge happened, and for what purpose. What is the Israeli mechanism in order to maintain the Palestinian refugees situation, and what it benefits from this situation, and to put the question about how to implement the right to return, not to stay only on the discussion in theory about the right to return, but if we want to promote or to push or to give any progress in the process of the right to return, we believe that we should ask the question how we can implement the return and what aspects, what practical aspects we should take in our consideration when we talk about the right to return. We believe that if you want to achieve or to reach a political goal, you should put a plan and start steps in order to implement this plan. Unfortunately, I can say that regarding the implementation of the right to return, I didn't find any program or any plan or any political action in order to achieve this goal, despite the fact it's very wide among the Palestinian collective awareness and political demands, of course, among the Palestinian refugees, but no one gave a feasible and practical way how to implement that. Not for us as Palestinians, not for the international community, and of course, not for the Israeli side, because they are, of course, relevant to this case. So I believe that we all know already that the Nakba that started formally in 1948, which was actually 48 is the year that the massive and the crucial events happened at that year. But in fact, we consider the Nakba start earlier than 1948. We can start with Balfour Declaration and preparing the Palestinian area for creating a Jewish state with a Jewish majority. And in order to create Jewish majority, you need to have only Palestinian minority. And for that, you cannot achieve the political goal and the political statehood of Jewish state without emptying, without taking the Palestinians out of the borders of the state that will be created very soon. So the first basic assumption I want to put here that ethnic cleansing of Palestinians and Palestinian refuge was actually built in the whole idea of creating a Jewish state with Jewish majority. Without kicking the Palestinians out, you will not achieve that one. I hope you see the screen. Thank you. We already know that the number of the Palestinian refugees in 1948 was about 750,000. Some researchers will talk about 800,000, 850,000. Some Israeli numbers will talk about 600,000, but most of the documents talk about 750,000 Palestinians. As I said, they were expelled not only in 1948, of course in 1947, but we also know about different kind of expulsion that we call it economical and colonial expulsion that happened in 1920s and 1930s when some Zionist companies bought lands in Palestine and they kicked the villages that lived in that land outside of their historical lands. About 60 Palestinian villages were expelled in the 90s and the 30s in this way. In 1947, 8, 9, 50, 51, we talk about 600 Palestinian towns and cities and villages that had been expelled and erased from the landscape. Only few cases you can still find the original Palestinian neighborhoods or villages are still standing, but 99% of the Palestinian houses and villages were totally destroyed. The refugees are not as a result of a war that happened in 1948 between Israel and the Arab countries, because the expulsion started before the war started. The war started in May 15th, but the expulsion started in the end of 1947, December 1947. And it continued after the war ended. The war ended in 1949. some Palestinian villages were expelled in 1950 and 51. In some meaning, we can see the same practice by Israel is done against Palestinian communities till today in the West Bank, in Area C, in East Jerusalem, in Silwan, in Sheikh Jarrah, but also inside Israel with the Palestinian Bedouin in the southern part of the state of Israel, in the Naqab, in the Negev. They push the Palestinian communities to townships and confiscate their historical lands in order to disconnect the Palestinian families from their homeland and from their private lands. Beside the number of the refugees that were considered refugees that found themselves outside of the borders of the state of Israel, we have also 30,000 people that became IDPs, internal refugees, inside the borders of the state of Israel. These numbers of 1948-49. And despite the fact that they became citizens of the state of Israel, Israel didn't allow them to return to their original houses and towns. And this will be a very good question to the end of the discussion if we talk about the right to return, and the refusal of Israel to the right to return is because of demographic conditions and demographic reasons. This group of the IDPs will not change the demographic situation. So we should ask the question why Israel does not allow them to go back to their original houses, because moving from Nazareth to Safuri, the original village that is far away, about 5 minutes only from Nazareth, will not change the demographic situation in Israel. So what is the real reason that Israel is not allowing them to go back to their villages? The number of the refugees will be increased also in 1967. We talk about 300,000 people that had been expelled outside of the West Bank, mainly to Jordan, and became refugees till today. And these refugees, mainly in 1948, were expelled from, as I said, about 600 localities, leaving beyond them the whole life that they had for generations. It's the culture and the identity and the collective identity and of course, the physical property, the lands and the houses and the homeland, with the whole meaning of a homeland. Israel expelled, as I said, by clear orders for the Israeli forces to expel Palestinian families, even after they managed to come back or to return to their villages when and after the clashes finished or the war ended. We have 2 or 3 documents from 1948, Israeli documents, telling exactly what is the mission for the soldier to go to that village. This talks about number of villages in the south of Israel, very close to the border with Gaza Strip today. And there are information that some families came back to their villages. The mission now to go to these villages and to kick out these families, even to bring buses and to force them to go outside of our borders, as the document says, and to send them back to Gaza in order to prevent their possible return again. You need to destroy the houses and to burn the villages in order to block their hope or their possibility to come back again. So it was clear for the Israeli army in the second half, of course, of 1948 and 1949, the expulsion should be done by force, and preventing the return is also one of the missions of the Israeli army on the lines, on the borders. The Israeli state was declared in May 14th, and the Israeli government had a discussion on the question of Palestinian refugees in June 1948. and they had decided not to allow them to come back. And they gave orders, as I said, to the army to prevent their return in any way, even shooting them. And we know that some thousands, we don't know the exact number, but some thousands of Palestinian citizens, civilians, had been shot and killed just because they wanted to step back to their houses and their villages. And at that time, in June 1948, the Israeli government composed a committee that is known in Hebrew and in Israel as the Transfer Committee. They asked the Transfer Committee to give the government recommendations what to do with the Palestinian refugees and what steps we should take on the ground in order to prevent their return. And they suggested to destroy their houses or to settle Jewish families in the Palestinian houses in order to protect the borders or to prevent the Palestinians to return, not to allow them to use their lands, to cultivate their lands, because some of the Palestinian refugees remained for months very close to their agricultural lands, and they managed to collect their fruits and vegetables. Now the Israeli government will stop that, and to have new laws, Israeli laws, should be legislated in order to prevent the return. In 1950, 1.5 years after that, we will have the absentees property law, that Israel, by this law, actually confiscated formally the whole property of the Palestinian refugees that were expelled in 1949-48. So from that time, we already know that the Israeli approach and the Israeli policy is to expel Palestinian families as much as possible, and on the other hand, to prevent their return if they try to do so. This is against the international law and against the international conventions that acknowledge the refugees' right to return to their homelands after the war ended or the dangerous situation finishes. In the case of Israel, of course, we know till today, Israel did not implement the international law and the United Nations solutions. We'll talk about the solution number 194 that calls to open the borders for Palestinian refugees to return. At the same time, Israel was accepted to the United Nations in 1940, in the end of 1948, I think, 1949, with its commitment to implement the international law and the United Nations solutions, including 194 that was already approved in the United Nations in December 1948, by the way, December 11th, a few days from today. At the same time, 1 year after, the United Nations will create special agency for the Palestinian refugees support, as known the UNRWA, that started to its action with the Palestinian refugees in 1950. And according to UNRWA, Palestinian refugees whose normal place was in Palestine during the time of 1946, in June 1946 till May 48, and they lost both home and means of livelihood as a result of the 1948 conflict. According to the Israeli law, Palestinian absentee person that left Palestine, or the land that became the state of Israel, and moved to enemy countries, enemy states like Jordan, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, by the way, and Iraq, or moved to part of Palestine that's still not inside the state of Israel, means the West Bank and Gaza. So all Palestinians that had been kicked out from the area that became the state of Israel, considered as according to the Israeli law, as Palestinian absentees, and they don't have the right to return. In contrast to the international law or to the United Nations approach, the Israeli law said they don't have the right to return. The 194 solution is very important one that says very clearly that Palestinians that seek to live in peace with their neighbors are allowed to return and to get back their property and their houses. The United Nations continued to confirm this solution year by year till today, by the way. And even in 1974, in the decision number 3236, they affirmed not only the right to return, but they also considered the right to return as a value that no one can touch or no one can make it weaker or to shape that according to political situation. It's an unalienable right for the Palestinians to return, as the solution, as the decision said in 1947. In the Palestinian understanding, and of course in the international law, return is a private and collective right. Even if there is a political solution that will not allow return, but there's still a private right that every person, every private Palestinian refugee can demand their return to the property and the houses that they left beyond. One of the arguments is how come that the Palestinians, after 70 years, are still demanding their right to return? Why this is the only case in the world that third and fourth generation still defined by the United Nations as refugees, and they are defined as refugees according to the UNRWA definition, the United Nations definition. First of all, it's not the only case. The United Nations works in different places in the world in order to make the return possible for communities that forced to leave their homelands. We know that third generation refugees in Iran from Afghanistan are still considered by the United Nations as refugees, even they are third generation. The same with the Somalian refugees that are forced to move to Kenya or to Sudan or to other African countries. And even the United Nations succeeded in 2014 to make a return plan with the Somalian government for dozens of thousands of Somalian refugees after 2 generations of refuge, after about 20 and 25 years. So it's not the only case that the Palestinian demands to return 4 generations. And in ironic way, I can say this is really absurd that we hear that from the Israelis, because the Israelis and the Zionist approach talk about 2,000 years of return after 2,000 years, they return to their homeland. So if 2,000 years are okay, why 70, 75 years are not? So in the whole meaning, we of course, in our organization, as Zochrot works inside the Israeli society, we fully support the right to return. And we also follow the Palestinian actions about the return and the meaning of return. And as I said in the beginning, we know that the Palestinian refugees demand this right strongly and in every opportunity, but they don't make many things in order to make the step for the return. But what they do, at least in the last 10 or maybe 20 years, the Palestinian refugees started to document their destroyed villages from their memory, sometimes by visiting their places in different ways or sending someone like me to visit the place and to document what is in there. And the old people of the village, from their memory, drawed or created a model of their non-existing village. Like this a person, Abu Na'mi, is about 80 years when he created this model of his destroyed village, Ikrith. Well, he has access to his village because he lives in the Galilee, and his village is about half an hour far away from his current house today in the Galilee. So he visits the place and he talks about his village, but the thing that he managed to do is to give the second and the third generation how the village looked like before it was destroyed, which is very important, very strong step in order to maintain the image of the village, how it was before the destruction and the erasure. By the way, this village was one of two cases that the Israeli army did not occupy them by attack. They just came to the village and asked the people to leave just for 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks, they want to fix the border with Lebanon, and they will allow them to come back. And these 2 weeks never stopped till today. Two of these villages, Ikrit and Kufr Baram, are two Christian villages. 100% of the population are Christians. And this village, in 1951, 2 years after the expulsion, after the polite expulsion by the Israeli army declared the area as military zone. And in 1951, in Christmas evening, 24th of December, the Israeli air forces bombed the village and destroyed the whole houses. So imagine when they did that, of course, they knew the village, the nature of the people, the religion of the people, and they knew that the people are now in Haifa or in the Galilee are preparing for the prayer or the celebration of Christmas. At the same hour, they came with the airplanes and bombed the houses, and the houses are totally destroyed till today. By the way, we are visiting and making an activity in the village in the 25th of December this year with the refugees community. They will have a prayer in the church and celebration of the holiday. This is another plan that also an old man that lives in the Galilee did for his village, Kafr Anan. The village is totally destroyed, and he actually numbered the houses that were located in the village, and he added the names of the owners of each house. So we know all the families that lived till 1948 in this village of Kufr Anan, for example. The people of Ain Karim, a village in Jerusalem, which is, by the way, it's an expelled village, but not destroyed. All the original Palestinian houses are still there. And Israel uses this village as a very exotic and touristic area. And this map that you see is the touristic map that Israeli organizations made. The Palestinian refugees took the same map and changed the names from the Israelized, Hebraized names to the original names in Arabic. So we have the map now, and we can go and walk in the streets of the Ain Karim village, and we understand that here was the name in Arabic like that, and like that, and like that, instead of the Israeli map. We can consider this as a kind of decolonization map, decolonization action of the Israeli map when we read the names, the original names in Arabic. This is another village of Miska. I'm giving these examples as are part of this effort of Palestinian refugees in order to keep before they pass away. By the way, I think that they did that in the last 10, 15 years because they felt that they had nothing to do more, and now they are old, so at least they want to keep for the other generations the image of these villages. So we have hundreds of these maps or texts or plans that simple people did by their own hands from their own memory. The younger generations do some actions in the destroyed villages. Mainly they do visits and tours and political demos or visiting in the holidays their destroyed villages. We in Zochrot, sorry, yes, Sarah.
I just want to say a few more minutes if you're able. We have many questions for you. So if that's okay with you, Omar? Mm-hmm.
If you give me 10 minutes, it will be better. So we consider our actions on the ground in these days. For the last 20 years, we do that, tours and documenting the places and putting signs in order to make the village a little bit alive for a short time. We see that as a symbolic return, not only visiting a place with Nakba, with sorrow, with history, but also as an optional space for justice, an optional space for return. So I think this is very important when you ask the people to look at the space, not only as a place of destroyed place, but also as a place that could be rebuilt and could give hope for the people in the way to justice. In order to promote the question of return and the right to return, we ask the question, the direct questions. Okay, we do support the right, but how and where the Palestinians will return? What we will do with the Israeli cities? We have here about 7 million Israeli Jews and hundreds of Israeli towns and villages and kibbutzes and cities. You can see this neighborhood was erased totally and became the promenade of Tel Aviv over here, between Tel Aviv and Jaffa. We started to create workshops, to organize workshops for Palestinian IDPs inside Israel, but also with some Israeli Jewish activists to think, what is the meaning of return? What do you think? What do you imagine? How do you imagine this area, including return? Where the Palestinian refugees will live? This question raised up many other questions. What is the number of the refugees today? It's about 10 times than it was in 1948. So we need 10 times places or homes or spaces in order to absorb the Palestinian return, where it will be and how it will be done. How do you imagine your village after you build that? Some Palestinian fourth generation IDPs did a research about their village and they built kind of model how it will be in the future. This is again one more destroyed Palestinian village, but here we can see how it will be after it will be built. This one also another village, al-Lajun, young Palestinian IDPs imagined to build again the village of al-Lajun or al-Ghabsiya the same way. By the way, all of them, and this is another example of Kufr Ber'im, the village that I mentioned before, an artist from the village, Hanna Farah, also rebuilt his village in this photo. And all of them had very similar mottos. One of them is any kind of project of a new modern village should include some historical elements from the old village, how they remember or how they knew from their grandfathers and grandmothers. The other thing, they thought that the historical area should be a collective public area for the returnees. This will be the schools and the culture center and the open space for the whole community, and the new neighborhoods will be built around the old part of the village. So to conclude, we suggest to enter this process of imagining return and planning return from today, even if this will be implemented maybe 2 decades from today. Now we should start to think about how return will look like and should look like. We need a process of preparation. We should prepare ourselves. We should prepare the Palestinian refugees themselves, because we will actually smash their dream when we bring them the reality and inform them that Palestine that they lived in 1948 is not the same Palestine that they will see today. The conditions on the ground are not the same as they imagine the area that they lived in 1948. Many things were changed, and the colonization of their villages made a lot of changes. It's not logical that we will destroy everything in order to create again the oldest situation of Palestine 48. The return should be to this moment, to this time, to the modern time, with the needs of the new generation. My grandfather was a farmer. My son is not a farmer. He's an high-tech guy. He will work different things. So the think and the imagination should also talk about the nature of the new generations of Palestinian refugees, what they will do in their life, and how the villages will look like when they will be rebuilt. Inside these questions, they should ask more or deeper questions, economical ones, social ones. Are we sure that all Palestinians that had been expelled have enough land for all their descendants today? We are sure that they are not all of them. So how will look the return for Palestinians that don't have private land in Palestine, where they should return to? And who should take responsibility in order to implement their return? If we want to implement return in the current political situation, do we have to do kind of priority? Maybe the Palestinians in Syria and Lebanon deserve the support more than Palestinians in Europe. Should it be gradual return, supported by the international community and the Arab countries? Of course, Palestinians by themselves will not do that alone. What will be the role of Israel? How it should and will accept return? We are sure that Israel will not easily accept return for many reasons, but still, if you have the political goal, you should work on that regardless what the oppressors think about. And if we give kind of plan, it could help people to see that it is not only a right, not only a justice, but also possible and feasible and practical. Beside the moral approach and the humanitarian principle that must be done because they deserve that, it's also practical, and even it will make good for the whole people that live in that space. We can learn from other examples in the world, mainly in, for example, South Africa, or in Mozambique in Africa also had a case of return from former Yugoslavia. Many areas that had justice after long conflict can give us ideas how people can live under the title of equal citizens in the same political system, in the same country. I mean by that return should also talk about the rights of the citizens in the future country that should be and will be built in this area. Of course, it will affect the nature of this Israeli state. It will not be Jewish state. It will not be a state that one nation or one ethnic group is superior and the others in low status. This will not work. It didn't work for 70 years. It will not work in the coming future. So I believe that the return, after the discussion, of course, the refugees should take part in this discussion, and these decisions will take us to different ways of returns. It will not happen that one type of return will work. It doesn't mean all the time that return will be in the specific location of the destroyed village, because in many cases you will not see the village and in its location because of Israeli cities and towns. But still, most of the Palestinian refugees are in empty areas, in parks or forests, for example. In these cases, we can rebuild the village and people can return to there. But in cases that it faces a big Israeli community, we should find different solutions and different kinds of returns. For example, why Palestinian refugees could not or should not join an existing Israeli city, for example. Who decided that Palestinians and Jews in normal situation, in normal country, should live separately? In the normal states, people in different religions and in different colors live in the same place. So we should imagine a future in this way and in this kind of type of life, and to consider the return not only to a private house, a private home, but to the homeland in general. And if the Palestinian refugee will decide that this is my return, I got my homeland back, and it doesn't matter where I live, in Jaffa that I forced to leave in 1948, or in Nazareth that I like to live in 2048. So this is a return also.
Omar, thank you so much for what a fabulous presentation. I know it's really helped all of us to kind of see, from the beginning to the end to the future, kind of how this can happen. So thank you. I'm just going to very briefly review our action. So Ryan will share what the action will be in the text here. So in the chat, you can see on the slide that we'd like to write reviews of parks and forests in Israel, informing people of the Palestinian villages buried underneath. We have many questions for Omar. We'd like to still get a couple, so please copy and paste from the chat so that you can still have this action and continue to work on it after our event today. Omar, do you have anything you'd like any thoughts on our action for the week?
Sorry, again, action of?
So we're asking people this week, to write a review, like a Google review of different national forests that are on top of Palestinian villages, and to tell people who are looking up these reviews about the Palestinian villages that are underneath them. Yeah, is there any thoughts you have that you would like to say about that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I invite people to visit the website of Zochrot and the Facebook of Zochrot, because in these days, we had a campaign talking about the villages under the JNF forests. As I said, there are dozens of them. And someone mentioned Lubia over here. Yeah, the village of Lubia, we visited last month. And I also prefer that people can maybe write and spread the knowledge about the village of Ikrith. I mentioned that the houses were bombed in Christmas, because in these days we are visiting the village of Christmas. By the way, part of their lands also under parks and JNF forests.
Thank you, Omar. So we'll leave this information up for people while we ask a few questions. Thank everyone, the participants here, for giving some really great questions. Well, sorry, we won't have time for all of them. So I'm gonna ask two questions together. If you have information, like, is there an idea of what percentage of Palestinians would like to return, if the opportunity to return was given? And then another question related to that, who might work towards a realistic plan for return that could get the backing of the United Nations or the US in order to pressure Israel to accept it? Do you have ideas on how that could happen?
Well, first of all, we don't have any survey that can tell us how big the percentage of Palestinians that want to return. Our assumption for our work is that all of them should have the right to return. So any plan should take in consideration that all of them will come back. But to be realistic, and of course, as we know from other cases in the world, not all of them will do that. Of course, not in the beginning. I assume that Mali Palestinians that live in good conditions, for example, in Europe or in the North America, they will not do that immediately. But politically, I don't suggest to anyone to do, okay, let's do the right to return in condition that we have only a small number of returnees. No, the assumption is all of them should and can return. I think there was a survey that had been done by Shukaki institution, Palestinian researcher, a few years ago, and still have a big majority of Palestinians that insist to their right to return, and they will implement the return if they have the opportunity. Who should do the plan? First of all, the Palestinian leadership. Palestinian leadership should give to the United Nations a plan for implementation the right to return. It seems that no one is interested and no one believes that right to return will be and should be implemented. So it looks weird and strange that no formal institution has this plan and no one is pushing to implement that. So I think I blame the Palestinian leadership, because even some of the speeches and the discourse in the last decades, even giving Israel some hints, don't worry, we don't talk about real right to return, including the Palestinian president, unfortunately.
Thank you. Another question was asking, how does Israel justify to the United Nations its refusal of the right of return, like when it's illegal in international law to do so?
Yeah. First of all, that they describe the return as a dangerous for the public in Israel and the Jewish state. And because the international community and the international law and the United Nations acknowledged a Jewish state, so they cannot do something that will change or dismantle the Jewish recognition of the state, which is, of course, very racist approach. No one should accept that, but this is one of the Israeli excuses. The other thing that Palestinians or returnees are still kind of enemy of the state of Israel, so it's not logical that we accept enemies that will maybe make a revenge when they return. And of course, it will change the demographic situation, which is by itself dangerous for the state of Israel and the nature of the state of Israel. All these excuses, as he said, based on racist approach, we should not accept, but this is the Israeli voices when they talk about why they will not allow our return.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Omar, for sharing your time with us and your knowledge with us. I know there's interest in being able to access the slides you shared. They were so informative. So Ryan will follow up with you on that. We want to thank everyone for joining us today. A link to the video of this gathering, as well as all the links that were shared, will be posted on the Kumi Now website and on YouTube, so you can still access those, share them with your friends and family. And you can subscribe to Kumi Now on YouTube and subscribe to our newsletter to make sure that you receive them. So again, please share this session and invite people to join us next week. We'll be focusing on the Syrian Golan next week. We hope to see all of you back here in a week's time. Again, thank you, Omar and Sibyl, and everyone here.
Thank you very much.